Hi team, in this video I'm going to speak to the goal of full employment. So you need to understand what that means. There's some terminology here that you need to get your head around. You also need to know how full employment is measured, the difference between cyclical and structural unemployment, and then finally the consequences if we do not achieve the goal. So similar to the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, we're looking at the meaning, the measurement, and the consequences. So this is your bog standard definition for full employment. We're looking at a maximum level of employment that's achieved without triggering excess inflationary pressure. I'll speak to that in a moment. And where there is no cyclical unemployment, and also cyclical unemployment, we're obviously going to cover that too. We're looking at a number at around 4.5%. So make sure at the end of this video you go back to this definition and that all these sort of new terms that have propped up in this definition are making sense to you. Okay, you also need to know the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, referred to as the NIRU. So it's a fancy way of talking to the goal of full employment, and it represents an unemployment rate in which inflation remains stable over time. So we don't want unemployment to be equal to zero. First of all, that's not possible. Second of all, if that were to happen, we're going to have some very unintended consequences happening in other areas of our economy, particularly in relation to inflation. So we want to have an unemployment rate that doesn't cause inflation to go too high and doesn't cause inflation to go too low. And we'll cover off sort of the link between unemployment and inflation when we look at the goal of price stability in the next video. Okay, but for now, make sure you know this definition. And so here's a great question that you could get. Explain what is meant by the goal of full employment for 2 marks. Pretty confident this was on 2022's exam. Really, the students that got 2 out of 2 for this were able to obviously use those 2 terminologies, the goal of full employment, and then couple it with the NIRU, and that got them the 2 out of 2 marks. So once again, more definitions. Okay, we're going to open with cyclical unemployment. So there's going to be so many different types of unemployment that come up in this video. My advice to you is to handle the terminology by adding it to your glossary, obviously going over the terms so they make sense to you, and then we'll start to categorize them as we work through the video. So cyclical unemployment is basically caused by this scenario here on the right-hand side. So if we have a decrease in aggregate demand, we know that that's coupled with a decrease in output, which means that the demand for labor is going to fall, which means unemployment is going to go up. So basically, if we go back to our goal for a moment, the goal says that we want cyclical unemployment to be equal to 0. So we are striving to achieve a level of unemployment where there is no lack of aggregate demand. So if you think about your business cycle for a moment, we're looking for those sweet spots where we hit our long-term trend, ultimately where all the goals are humming together, and such that cyclical unemployment, where there is a lack of aggregate demand, would not exist, such that cyclical unemployment is equal to 0. All right, so that's what's going on there. In contrast, another type of unemployment that generally gets touted around is this idea of structural unemployment. So this is completely different to cyclical. This one arises from fundamental changes in the economy, where there's a mismatch between the available skills and the job requirements, and it leads to long-term unemployment. So for example, you might be qualified as a bricklayer, and then there's some new type of robotic technology that completely decimates the bricklayer industry, and your skills as a bricklayer are no longer required, and you find yourself unemployed. So for you, you're going to have a pretty tough time going back into the workforce. It's highly likely you're going to need to reskill and retrain in an area where those skills are demanded. So you might find yourself unemployed until you're able to provide a skill that is in demand. So for this question here, which one of the following is likely to be classified as structural unemployment? I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I'm going to jump straight to D. I hope this doesn't happen to me. So if you've got a person who loses their job as an economics teacher due to a decline in the number of students studying economics. So if tomorrow everybody woke up and said, you know what, we don't want to study economics anymore, unfortunately I would be out of a job, so I would be structurally unemployed. All right, I want to introduce you to the labour force. So let's just have a quick look at the graphic on the right-hand side. This has come from the RBA's website. And so basically, think of Australia and everyone being over the age of 15 and also not retired as being part of that working age population group. Okay, so you are either between 15 and 65. You're either going to be in the labour force or you're not going to be in the labour force. Everybody falls into one of the 2 categories. So we want to talk specifically about the labour force. That includes everybody who is deemed unemployed or employed. So the portion of the population aged 15 years old or older who are able and willing to work and are either employed or unemployed. So even if you're unemployed, you are still considered to be in the labour force. That's really important to remember, team. Just because you don't have a job doesn't mean you're not included in the count, okay? So let's have a look. In your labour force, you're either going to be employed part-time, employed full-time, or unemployed. If you fall into any of those categories, you're in the labour force. On the flip side of that, we've got everybody in those age groups that are not in the labour force. So they might not be looking for other reasons. Maybe they're studying, maybe they're full-time stay-at-home parents, maybe they're in prison. These people aren't looking for jobs, so they therefore are not considered to be unemployed, and we'll get into that in more detail in a moment. They might be retired, or they might have other reasons why they are unable to work. Really important to get your head around this piece over here. Make sense of the labour force, employed plus unemployed. Okay, now there's a lot of terminology on this page. I'm not going to spend this video going through it, okay? That's a lot of me talking at you. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, write all this terminology down, learn your definitions. Basically, these are the kinds of terms that could come up in the course, and you need to be in a position to speak to what they are. I will point out two of them. This one over here, unemployed. So if you're unemployed, you're over the age of 15, you're actively seeking work, but you can't find a job. That's super important when we get into the measurement, okay? And then this term over here, underemployment. This is basically saying someone's got a job, they are working, but they're not working at their full capacity. So it might be the case that they're qualified to be a university lecturer or, a CEO, but unfortunately because of a lack of demand for those skills or potentially some other issues in our economy, they find themselves making coffee as a barista. So just an extreme example for you, but the idea is that you're not being utilized to your full capacity, so you're underemployed, all right? Both those terms are going to come up again in this video. I'll let you look at this one in your own time. Okay. So that's a quick overview of employment, unemployment, and our labour force. Now we need to get a sense of how it is that we measure our labour force. So you guys just need to come in and speak to what these measurements are. You don't have to criticise them. You don't have to say they're good or bad. You just need to know what they are. So number one is the participation rate, okay? This is the percentage of people that are of working age, and we've said that's 15, that are in the labour force, okay? So if you took the whole population of Australia that fits in that age bracket between 15 and 65, and they've put their hand up to work, well, then they're going to be considered in the labour force, and we're going to compare that to the working age population in total. So that's going to give me a percentage, and that basically says, righto, what's the percentage of everybody in that age bracket that is in my labour force? Keeping in mind that if you're in the labour force, you're either classified as employed or unemployed. So let's keep going. Okay, so have a look at this data for me. I've just got the last 12 months worth or so, and you can see that the number is fairly consistent. Like, it doesn't jump around too much. For the most part, it's sort of sitting on the 66.5 scale. The back end of 23, it sort of hits 66.8, gets to 67, and then it drops back to 66.6. So not a lot of movement in our participation rate, which is neither good nor bad, but it suggests that of everyone that is able and willing to work in that bracket of 15 to 65, we've got 66.7% of those people as at February 2024 that are in my labour force. So they're either employed or they're actively looking for work and they're unemployed. Okay, number two is the unemployment rate. Now, this is the one we're going to be speaking to the most because we're looking at full employment and the definition literally speaks to the unemployment rate. You do need to be in a position to do some pretty simple calculations, so just be prepared for that. Make sure you've got your calculator. So we're talking about the percentage of people in the labour force who are unemployed. Now, I've put this graphic back here because I want you to focus on the green for a moment. So basically we're saying this segment here, this segment of the unemployed relative to the whole labour force is what tells me my unemployment rate. I'm not comparing it to the whole working age population. I'm only comparing it to my labour force. So to calculate that number, we've got the total number of unemployed people divided by the labour force. Now you'll note that I've written here employed plus unemployed. Let's be really clear. The labour force is equal to the employed plus the unemployed. So unemployed people divided by employed people plus unemployed people, and then you times that by 100 to give you a percentage, okay? So again, 12 months worth of data, guys. If we look at seasonally adjusted, I want you to look at seasonally adjusted where you can. It's basically just been adjusted to take out any extremities in the particular season, not something you need to know about. So March 23, we're sitting at an unemployment rate of 3.6%. Now that's really interesting because if we go back to our definition of the goal was 4.5%. So it's an interesting one because we're in a position where pretty much consistently over the past 12 months, we've seen the country existing at a point that is below the desired rate of unemployment. So if I said to you, are we currently achieving our goal? Well, we can only say, well, no, we're not currently achieving our goal, because if we were, that number would be much closer to 4.5%. And you can see throughout the last 12 months, it creeps up a little bit. It gets to 3.6899. In January 24, it sneaks over 4% to 4.1, and then it drops back down to 3.7%. So just be mindful of that. What's been going over the past 12 months, we are currently not achieving the goal. And if we look at the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, unfortunately, because the unemployment rate is lower than it should be, we've got more people earning disposable income, which increases aggregate demand, which puts pressure on inflation, such that inflation rates lately have been wild, okay? Okay, and then the last one, team, so the measurement of the labour force. So this is the underutilisation rate. This one comes up a lot as well. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around, but stick with me, you'll be fine. So we're dealing with the extent to which the labour force is not working at its full capacity, all right? Now that includes unemployed people. So we've got a segment of our labour force who have put their hand up to say, I need a job, I'd like to work, and for whatever reason, they're just unable to find a job. So those people are not being fully utilised. They are underutilised, okay? But the other piece here is that the underutilization rate also includes all those people who are underemployed. Now, our fancy little graphic back here doesn't stipulate underemployment. It simply just does employed plus unemployed, because underemployment is actually quite difficult to measure. It's really difficult to find out, right, who's working, but not working at their full capacity, who's got qualifications that don't match what they're doing. Very difficult to measure in reality. The government has a crack at it though. The ABS does try to measure the underemployment rate, and I'll show you that in a moment. So this is just a repeat of the definition from that key terminology slide before. And so our underutilization rate includes everybody that's not working at their full capacity, which is made up of unemployment plus my underemployment rates, okay? And again, let's have a look at some data. So we don't look at underemployment in isolation. I've asked you here to look at the underutilization rate. That's what we're covering, but it's good to see how they're connected, okay? So remembering that underutilization is unemployment plus underemployment. And if we follow those numbers through over the last 12 months, we can see there's been a general increasing trend in the underutilization rate. So basically, we've got a situation where there are more people who are finding themselves with jobs, but unfortunately they're not working to their full capacity. And if you go back to the underemployment rate data, again, it's only a slight increase, but nonetheless it is increasing. So let's have a quick summary for a moment. We've got a slight sort of increase followed by, a decrease in the unemployment rate, just on generally. And then we've got a slight increase in our underemployment rate. So if unemployment is slightly up, minusing the latest month where it's obviously dropped, and underemployment is slightly up, we're seeing overall our underutilization rate is actually going up as well. And so this implies that we've got resources that are not being used to their full capacity.